see you again at this CETRA Summer School. Before I start with my lecture, I would like to thank Regina Rogl and Daniela Schlager for their thoughts and our cooperation on the topic of agency in translation, and also Raphael Sandholm from the University of Stockholm for our collective thinking on situated cognition and translation and distributed agency. So let me see that you can see my slides. There you go. Yeah, and you see the names of my colleagues. So Regina Rogl and Daniela Schlager are working with me at the Socotrans research group here in Vienna, and Raphael at the University of Stockholm. So in this second lecture of mine, I discuss different perspectives on choosing the unit that you study. And I will especially concentrate on different perspectives within the so-called translator studies, in which translation is examined from sociological, cognitive, and cultural perspectives. And as this name, translator studies, suggests, the focus lies on translators, or of course also interpreters, and their roles and positions and the processes and practices that are involved in translation and interpreting, rather than on textual or linguistic structures only, maybe. So if you do your PhD project about translators, interpreters, you can approach them from different perspectives. You can study them as individuals or as larger entities like teams, groups, agencies, networks, and so on. And depending on this unit of analysis, you can tackle questions and concepts on different levels. For example, concepts like agency and translatorship that I mentioned in the title of this lecture might be seen and used in different ways. So still, agency and translatorship are just examples of concepts that strongly depend on the perspective that you take in your research. And I'm happy to hear whether there are other concepts in your PhD studies, PhD projects that you might want to rethink or specify depending on how narrow or broad you define the object of your research. Agency, of course, is one of the main concepts in current sociology. There's an age-old discussion in sociology on how agency could be defined, especially concerning the question of where it can be located in this spectrum between individuals and structure or society. In translation studies, one of the dominant definitions that I've seen also quoted quite many times is the one that Tuija Kinnunen and Kaisa Koskinen use in their introduction to the collective volume on translators' agency. And they define agency as the willingness and ability to act. And they point to the fact that agency implies the prerequisites of, first of all, having a particular internal state and disposition, as they write, a disposition of intentionality, then being able to act, and acting in the sense of exerting an influence. And I think this definition seems quite compatible, for example, with the conceptualization of activity in the activity theory tradition of sociology and psychology, because this activity theory, AT, also assumes intentional internal states and dispositions. Other scholars, on the other hand, like Bruno Latour, see agency in all action. So according to the actor network theory, ANT, agency is the ability to act with or without internal dispositions, and whether the action is intentional or not. Some of you might also be familiar with the debate regarding the different concepts of agency by Pierre Bourdieu and Bruno Latour, as they have been compared, for example, by Christina Abdallah in translation studies. And Bourdieu proposes a view in which social structures and individual choices interact, whereas Latour emphasizes the bottom-up interactions of human agents and artifacts that generate social structures in the first place. In this lecture, however, I will not focus on these more established sociological approaches to agency, but look at 3 different contemporary approaches in translation studies and how they can facilitate our understanding of translational or translatorial agency. They can all be seen as strands within these translator studies field, and they have been developed parallel to each other, and they share many characteristics. However, when you look at them in detail, they reveal interesting differences, I think. So in what follows now, I will compare the views according to a recent development in translator studies that focuses on individual translators and describes the life and work of specific translators. And I draw here strongly on my colleague Klaus Kindel's seminal work here at the University of Vienna. Here I call this strand individualized, person-oriented translator studies. Then the second one is this cognitive perspective of situatedness that describes activity from the perspective of an individual in situation. And I draw here, for example, from Andy Clark, Lucy Suchman, Robinson Idede, and so on. And then there is this third expanded socio-cognitive perspective that I talked about yesterday. And I call the approach extended translation. I draw here especially from Holland, Hutchins, Rogers, and others in that 4EA field. So the lower two, the latter two, the situated translation and extended translation, they stem from the translation studies subfield of cognitive translation and interpreting studies that relies on the 4EA cognition paradigm that I talked about yesterday in my first lecture. This 4EA as cognition as embodied, embedded, enacted, extended, and affective. And today I will especially focus on these cognitive and socio-cognitive perspectives because they have been hardly discussed in the context of translation agency, even though they also aim at explaining human action. So because they study the processes that enable humans to act, to make decisions, to exert influence. So I will try to retrace the disciplinary paths and scholarly motivations that have led to the different approaches. And I will also try to illustrate shortly the key points in the discussion with an empirical example from current research on activities in translation workplaces. Still, even though I want to stress here that even though I myself use the extended translation approach in my current research, I would like to stress that I do not advocate the use of one over the other exclusively. In fact, I really consider all these perspectives to be highly useful for constructing theoretically informed understandings of translation and interpreting. Also, before discussing the differences, I argue that the 3 perspectives actually mirror each other in their development and views. They all reject the notion of linguistically transparent, rule-based information processing as a basis for human translation. Individualized translator studies and studies of situated and extended translation are all not, I quote, not primarily concerned with texts, but with people, as Kindle puts it. They all assume that the choices made by translators cannot be sufficiently explained by an analysis of purely textual data, such as comparison of a translation with the source text or of different translation of the same text. So you cannot know why and how exactly this text was produced in that way. Also, all 3 approaches are descriptive. They do not primarily ask to or seek to model ideal conditions, or to give advice to practitioners or the translation industry, or to develop direct applications to advance translation technology or study programs. Not directly, they might have influence, but not directly as their main goal or the first primary goal. So because they try to describe and analyze actual events and connections. And they all see translators as active actors who don't just apply prescribed or learned rules or react to their environment, but actively contribute to shaping the environment too. So, and also they study unique human beings in unique contexts. They all also emphasize the aspects of embodiment and the visibility of real people. They strive towards humanization of translation studies. It is also this shared recourse to the Heideggerian being in the world in all three approaches that points to the similar origins and motivations of the approaches. So actually, I'd like to conclude that the three approaches are, in that sense, quite compatible in their basic motivations. Let's, however, look at the different origins of the three approaches and see where the differences lie. The journey of translation studies towards becoming a discipline in its own right began in the 1970s, you could say, as a branch of applied linguistics. Of course, translation studies has several origins, with applied linguistics being just one of the storylines, and others are running alongside. For example, the one from the field of comparative literature. But in line with the developments of linguistics at that time, translation studies scholars focused on comparing languages as rule-based coding systems, trying to identify equivalence and other relations between language systems in the study of translation. And as Kindle notes, this was also strongly borne by the assumption that translation is a computation that can be carried out by a computer as soon as the respective language symbols and rule symbols have been fully recorded. And in the 1980s, translation studies experienced a reorientation. These descriptive, functional, hermeneutic, and other approaches brought new aspects to the forefront of translation research. For example, interests, goals, prior knowledge of the actors involved, also their understanding, their potential, their limitations. So translation was now seen as dependent on the individual interpretations and choices of translators, and actor and action-centered approaches emerged. So in the last decades, studies of translators and interpreters from sociological, cognitive, and cultural perspectives have gained strength, with such approaches now all developing within translation studies in their own right, and contributing to the humanization of the discipline. And because of this long-term development, Andrew Chesterman speaks of translator studies as a sub-branch, quite a big sub-branch of translation studies. A logical extension of this development is what could be called the individualized translator studies, or person-oriented translation research. And this branch studies the histories, choices, effects, and relevance of individual translators, the translator as a person, and the translator as a translatorial subject, according to Klaus Kindl. It investigates the biographies, contributions, motivations of individual translators as key actors, with their own unique goals and backgrounds and strategies. So according to Klaus Kindl, such an approach can, I quote, provide us with a deeper understanding of the individual dimension of translation, end of quote. For example, with their edited volume Literary Translator Studies, Klaus Kindl, Waltraud Kolb, and Daniela Schlager lay a sound foundation for the person-oriented study of literary translators as individuals. And the concepts that are used there, for example, in the different papers, focus, for example, on the translator's voice, identity, posture, attitude. And the volume is devoted to the field of literary translation, where, of course, the increasing emphasis on the visibility of translators as of literary texts as individuals can be related to the traditionally high visibility of the authors of literary source texts. So it seems logical that this individualized perspective stems from work dealing with literary translation, where the authorship of individual authors is of particular importance. Let us now look at the origins and motivations of studying agency in the field of cognitive translation and interpreting studies. Remember that in the research on translation in the 1970s, one of the dominant explanations of translation was that translation is a computation that can be carried out by computer as soon as the respective language symbols and rule systems have been fully recorded. And a similar basis can be found in cognitive science, not incidentally, which initially emerged as an attempt to simulate human intelligence on the computer. So that was kind of one of the main goals right from the start, artificial intelligence. And behind this lay the assumption that thinking at that time, it was assumed that thinking is a linguistically and symbolically transparent coding, a calculation, a problem-solving process, a symbol manipulation process, in line with this notion of the propositional theory of mind. And this theory assumes that the world is represented in the brain as symbols, not as fuzzy scenes or images, for example, and that the symbols can be manipulated according to logical rules. So here the brain is a computer with the software of the symbols and rules. And ultimately this led, similar to translation studies of the time, to the human element being pushed out of the theory building or modeling. So because in this cognitive science approach, it is all about the correct application of learned or externally stored algorithms, independent of the human element or indeed the executing medium, whether it's a brain or any other medium. So just like in translation studies, and probably not totally by chance, there was a paradigm change in cognitive science in the 1980s. You remember certainly that in translation studies, these descriptive, functional, hermeneutic, and other approaches brought the interests, knowledge, understanding of the individual actors involved to the forefront of translation research in the 1980s. So translation was now seen as dependent on the individual interpretations and choices of translators. And a parallel development was initially also seen in cognitive science. New approaches that emerged in the 1980s saw experience-based learning as at the heart of cognition and intelligence. And that made cognition dependent on the individual perceptions, prior knowledge, experience, learning paths, and so on. And also in that way on the person doing the thinking. So this is the connectionist approach, the parallel distributed processing approach by Rumelhart and McClelland, for example, in the 80s. And these then new approaches saw the basis for thinking and learning in activation patterns of neural networks in the brain. Experience-based, action-oriented schemata emerged through repeated perceptions and activities and the feedback received in the process. These then new approaches of connectionism and parallel distributed cognition or processing argued that it is these flexible neural activation patterns that thinking is based on, these schemes, and that thinking is not based on rule-governed sequences of states that can be coded as symbols and syntactic structures. But now individuals with their own past learning and experience took center stage in these approaches. In the 1990s, however, further developments in cognitive science and also in cognitive translation and interpreting studies moved in a slightly different direction, to the direction of situated and later extended cognition and translation. So these were parallel developments, of course. And here, instead of emphasizing individual agency, the situated perspective stresses the circumstances in which an activity occurs. According to Lucy Suchman, these include layers of culturally and historically constituted social and material conditions that co-determine the activity and thus also translation. Any interpretation or action is always constructed and assembled in the here and now, depending on the unique situation. And of course, Lucy Suchman is one of the pioneers of situated cognition. She carried out observations on how people use photocopiers and was able to describe how people make sense of what happens and how they adjust their course of action accordingly. And she was very critical of the deterministic approach to planning assumed by technology designers and proposed this situated view of action. Suchman writes that activities are not fully specified in advance or in any strongly determinate way, but any act of understanding or decision-making, for example, must be actively reenacted in the here and now. So this view relativizes the idea of autonomous subjective agency by emphasizing the individual's independence on the situation. The influence of the situation is so strong that decisions and choices of an individual can only be understood by taking the situation into account. So studies relying on situatedness, this is the second approach that I'm talking about today. They do look at translation from the perspective of individuals, but always and equally importantly, they look at how the material and social environment contributes to or influences translation. One would, for example, look at how translators use certain tools, how translators are affected by their social setting, or how the resources available or social interactions in the situation affect the translation process. Situated cognition and translation also has a specific stance regarding goals and plans that is important for understanding agency in translation. It actually rejects the idea put forward by other cognitive theories that individuals make decisions according to their internal mental reasoning, that being able to act and deciding to act would depend on processes that are controlled by prior knowledge or experience exclusively. So according to this situated approach, the translator's individual or mental plans and goals do not steer translation, for example, directly. Even though for others, for us as researchers, for example, an activity, a translation activity process might seem very goal-oriented and appear to follow an a priori charted course, individual translators still navigate in their present environments. So the process itself is always situated and contingent according to this approach, depending on the cues and resources in that specific context. And individual goals and plans only help to form and understand an action in beforehand and afterwards, or by observers, but they do not determine and structure the actions themselves. According to such men, goals and plans are cultural resources, just like languages and checklists and other structuring factors. In the cognitive and socio-cognitive discussion, we also find different positions to the questions of whether only human beings, and maybe also, or I would say, of course, also other animate beings can exert agency. Can agency be granted to humans only, or could objects or artifacts also exert agency? Can they do that alone, or only when they are interweaved into a socio-cognitive system or unit, including human beings? Granting agency only and exclusively to human subjects is essential from Lucy Suchman's situated perspective. She explicitly seeks to retain this asymmetry, or she writes about the dissymmetry between persons and artifacts. And I think it's understandable because her research deals with, in a very critical way, with the fields of technoscience and engineering, where, of course, technology used to be in the center and any human and social aspects were always in the margins. So in contrast to that, she puts the human individual in the center of the cognitive process, and she stresses the differences between humans and non-humans, and she only grants agency to human beings. Some other current cognitive scientific approaches within the 4EA cognition cluster, especially extended cognition by Clark and Chalmers, Menery and others, and also distributed cognition by Edwin Hudgens, they shift their attention to these larger units as the entities that exert cognitive functions and implicitly or explicitly also agency. So according to these extended and distributed cognition approaches, the cognitive process is not carried out by individuals, but by the interactive unit of brain-body world. It is distributed across actors, objects, and the environment. So it's socio-cognitive rather than solely cognitive. Hutchins, for example, studied navigation in ships and airline cockpits, and he argued that ships and cockpits as activity systems have cognitive properties of their own that go beyond those of the individuals who participate in them. And of course, here artifacts play an active role. They are an integral part of the cognitive unit itself. This is also something that I mentioned yesterday in my first lecture. And they do not only amplify any existing individual capacity, like sight or memory or other cognitive capacities, but rather they transform the whole cognitive system. So the use of a specific technology results in a different set of practices, components, relationships, and so it results into a different system dynamic altogether. And these extended and distributed approaches seem to grant agency to humans and non-humans alike, to individuals and to technologies or other artifacts as an assemblage, as one big acting unit. And actually, this view is quite similar to actor network theory that was developed by Latour in this field of sociology. So there's a very close correspondence there. So in the case of translating, translatorial agency would not need to be located at the situation or system level, not at the level of individual actors, because here on the system level, the whole socio-cognitive system is the unit that is able to translate, not the individual person alone. And it seems to me that the same applies to translatorship. If we want to attribute a translation to its translator, we would, in that case, if we take this approach, we would attribute it to this unit of actors and objects and technologies that contributed to the genesis of the translation. So an extended translation approach focuses on how a socio-cognitive unit, such as translators and their material and organizational environments, like a publishing house or language service provider, generates a translation, rather than on how the identities and personalities of the individual translators influence their choices. So this extended translation approach assumes socio-cognitive processes even when there is no explicit collaboration between translators and other actors. So it's not, in that sense, the collaborative translation approach. The decision-making unit is a system of neural, bodily, social, technical elements, and all those contribute to the agency of this heterogeneous system as a whole. So the extended cognition approach actually assumes collective cognitive characteristics. Hutchins speaks here of supra-individual cognitive effects that differ from the cognitive characteristics and preferences and possibilities of the individuals who participate in such processes. Of course, here you could say the whole is greater and the whole is something other than the sum of its parts. Here, the extended translation approach that I use also draws from Bruno Latour's actor network theory. At the center here lies a network of actors and media and other elements that together generate designs, innovations, translations, and other products. But also, according to Latour, sociality itself. Ronald Gere argues here that the question is, what is the role of agency in such a cognitive system? Several advocates of distributed and extended cognition, they extend notions of agency to such systems as a whole. So this view advocates the notion of collective or distributed agency. Latour even attributes agency to artifacts like technologies as such. Okay, let us look at examples of how extended translation approach. This extended view can be applied in empirical research. In research on translation, one would focus, for example, on how translation agency with their project managers, in-house and freelance translators, revisers, clients, language technology tools, other technical communication resources, infrastructure, translate texts. Raphael Sandholm's research and also my study on of freelance translation, for example, they focus on how the translation process can be seen as an interaction process with material resources and with the social network. And the empirical example that I will discuss in my lecture today stems from our common work. One would also examine how literary or other texts emerge as products of the publisher, its networks, guidelines, processes. Here, for example, Pleyel reflects on the collaboration between different actors involved in the 3-decade process of retranslating the Bible into Swedish. And he success to see the translation teams in his study as cognitive systems and the different versions of the target texts and comments as cognitive artifacts mediating the understanding within the teams. Other studies applying an extended perspective would examine, for example, how digital translation platforms, how they generate translations, produce translations, by the interaction of human contributors with this technological infrastructure, or how simultaneous interpreting can be seen, as Martin de Leon and Fernandez Santana write, as a multimodal embodied cognitive activity that can extend beyond the interpreter's organism. Another interesting example in this context is memory, as it is an important cognitive element or function. And it is also featured in this empirical example that I will discuss in more detail later. According to Edwin Hutchins, because memory is more than just the sum of specific set of specific mental processes, it would not actually be possible to understand human memory or how people remember, even if we had a complete understanding of human mental processes, neural processes, because memory also depends strongly on the position, on the activation status and the environment in which we find ourselves at the moment of remembering, trying to remember. Also on current perceptions that support or influence certain memories, and on material artifacts like databases, books, checklists, spatial layout. And memory also depends on immaterial artifacts, language structures, motor routines. It depends on social infrastructures like co-workers, social platforms, agreements, and conventions. And all those serve as hints and scaffolds, these frameworks, to support our thinking and doing and memorizing. So an explanation on the level of the individual view would, from this viewpoint, be reductionist. When you take this as a foundation for concrete research projects, many key decisions will need to be made regarding the methodology and research design. Situated and distributed or extended approaches emphasize the relevance of methodological research designs that study the activity in the wild, as Hutchins puts it. That is the ethnographic studies with recording and analysis of participant interactions and statements. So, for example, you would use participatory observation, qualitative interviews, artifact analysis. And my lecture number 3 will deal with this field research methodological approach. Also, a research agenda committed to situatedness and extendedness would give preference to an analysis that is data-based and bottom-up, as this way of doing research tries to protect against premature theoretical or other assumptions. So meticulous data acquisition and very systematic analysis can uncover developments and connections that might be surprising, and they might be counterintuitive. They might be seemingly illogical, contingent, and non-linear. So in a concrete observational study, for example, the empirical setting and the unit of analysis would need to be specified in a coherent way with the theoretical background that you use. One can use to study translation in a more limited spatial and temporal frame and concentrate on the activities of an individual and the influence on the local immediate context of translation. This methodological decision would correspond most closely to Suchman's approach of situated cognition. And alternatively, one could use to study a social network, a workplace, a department, an agency, or other larger unit as an empirical setting, and you could analyze the joint dynamics of this overall system. And this would correspond to the distributed extended cognition view, but also to the view of actor network theory by Latour. So in planning research designs, I also still think that extended translation studies can draw on recent discussions on collaborative translation and multiple translatorship, because I think they share similar concerns, even if they might not refer to current cognitive scientific developments. I would like to give you an example of how the translation process can be analyzed in light of the situated perspective on the one hand and this extended and distributed perspective on the other. I will use an extract from a conversation between two translators communicating via instant messaging. The extract is retrieved from Raphael Sanholm's ethnographic data that is made up of observational, interview, documentary, communication data. And we use this data in a paper that we recently wrote together, that will actually be published in the journal Target. So let me first describe the empirical setting. It is the Swedish translation office of a global language service provider, and the translators featured in this instant messaging chat, they belong to the general technology team of this translation agency. They are translators of this technology team. The translator that we call Elsa is fairly new to the translation profession, and the other translator with the pseudonym Hugo has worked as a translator for 16 years, 15 years in this workplace. And the conversation starts as Elsa reaches out to Hugo for assistance on what appears to be the interpretation of a specific source text item. So, okay, let's try. Approaching this kind of interaction from a situated perspective means taking the individual translator as the point of departure. The analysis would focus on Elsa's interactions with different resources and the way she interactively and discursively modifies the conditions for getting relevant information and input from her colleague. She contextualizes the problematic source text item by naming the client. I'm working on a small client, and she states that she has consulted the relevant translation memory and glossary, but has deemed them unhelpful. There is nothing in the memory or the glossary. He formulates assumptions about the meaning of the source term, so that sort of renders the location and reconsiders these assumptions. That's better. So something like 10 Hertz saves location saving, which happens in response to Hugo's assumption on line 22. I take capture to mean that you save locations. Rather than following a preconceived plan for reaching a solution, this unfolding of the conversation suggests a dynamic interaction with situation-specific resources. Assumptions about meaning emerge and are formulated throughout this process. From this situated perspective, it is the individual translator's cognitive processes that take center stage, but these processes unfold interactively with the use of external resources, including social resources. Okay, when approaching the same piece of data from an extended or distributed perspective, the boundaries of the unit of analysis can be extended to include both actors, their tools, teams, and so on, the whole organization actually. The material resources are not reduced to external aids, which support individual memory. Instead, they are seen as part of the socio-cognitive system that does the remembering. So from this perspective, both this disclosure of unhelpful resources, there's nothing in the memory or glossary, and Hugo's insistence that textual and translation memory resources are to be used could be taken to indicate how the task at hand unfolds on the system level. He asks, have you checked the source text? Here's some descriptive texts and a link to a website found. There's a link to another website. Or in the concordance search, if the concordance search gets slow, you can deactivate all memories except for the two main ones. So at the same time as they are working, interacting, Hugo successfully prevents Elsa from acting against company policy. They are not supposed to ignore the material resources and resort to ad hoc solutions, but they are supposed to rely on the tools, check and also correct their content, and to add content as they work. And also some elements in this interaction are indicative of previous activities of a similar kind. Terms such as minnet, the memory, glossary, the glossary, and konkordanssöka, do a concordance search, are used in a way that suggests previous usage and common ground, kind of the existence of a certain company preference and policy, implicitly and explicitly, or explicitly. So extending the unit and the analysis from an individual to these larger units of time and space makes it visible and understandable how individuals, single actions and translations are formed by phenomena and dynamics on the system level, and how they themselves construct and transform a material, social, and organizational system of translation. So in their interaction, they build on the whole system and they contribute to building the whole system. I think the choice of instant messaging actually as means of communication in the first place is of particular interest because here a traceable record of contributions and resources are created as the interaction unfolds. A structure is also here built up which may function as a scaffold, as this kind of a supporting framework for remembering. And these links to online resources, they remain in place and can be revisited at a later time or date. So for me, this example illustrates quite nicely how remembering in translation departments unfolds as a collective effort. Translation memories and other storage media are not only actively used, but also constantly maintained so that the knowledge in the organization, not only in the individuals, knowledge management idea from an applied perspective, that this knowledge that exists today, that it remains available in an adequate form in the future and for all who need it across the whole organization. And we do not only witness Elsa trying to solve a problem with Hugo's help, but we also unearth evidence of Hugo, Elsa, the source text, instant messaging, and so on. There's also these organizational practices and preferences acting as a socio-cognitive production system. There's much more going on than trying to understand a term. There are, at the same time, they are kind of constructing and transforming the organizational system of translation. They do not only use material and social system to solve one problem, they build and transform the system by adding further elements to it, and they strengthen some of its practices by conforming and repeating these practices. So to understand this system level and socio-cognitive dynamics, we need to expand the unit and the time frame that we consider and analyze in our empirical research. The study of agency in translation raises some exciting questions and for translation studies, I think. who is actually translating? Is it a translator or a translation agency, a team, a network? Whose words are the words in a translation? Who or what does the remembering of terms and phrases? Where is the unit located that chooses what and how to write? If I refer to Koskinen's and Kinnunen's definition of agency, is the individual translator or the team or an organization able to translate, maybe also a society, able to translate, willing to translate? Is a translation memory or a machine translation system able to translate or even willing to translate? I myself personally, I see a lot of potential in these extended approaches in which the whole socio-cognitive unit, including human and non-human components, are seen integral to this system. And I do not see it as an alternative, but as a complement to more individually oriented studies. If we try to explain the making of translation, we can study translators, their identities and personalities, but we can also ask how a publisher or a language service provider remembers its resources and practices. And I'm here kind of rephrasing the title of a very prominent article by Edwin Hutchins. He wrote, how does the article, the title of the article is How a Cockpit Remembers Its Speeds. So we investigate the distributed and collective agency of the translation bureau, kind of the agency of the agency. So to summarize, in this lecture today, I discussed how individualized translator studies tends to focus on individual translators, their identities, personalities, while situated and extended translation approaches instead explain translation as a process that is carried out in interaction with or by socio-cognitive, socio-technical organizational units. They go back to similar original motivations, but originally concentrate on different fields of translation, literary or non-literary translation. They define the borders of the unit of analysis differently, and they emphasize different methods. I think given all those similarities and differences of the approaches, it seems legitimate to juxtapose the person-oriented, individualized research tradition, the situated translation approach, and the distributed extended translation approach. They have each chosen a slightly different path when it comes to identifying the unit that they define as the actor or whose activities they seek to explain. Individualized translator studies do take a more individualistic approach to translatorship than the situated and extended translation approaches, because they, rather than emphasizing individual agency, situated and extended approaches shift their attention to the context that is distributed across actors, objects, and environment. From a situated perspective, agency is allocated to the human actor, the translator, who interacts with the elements of the environment and who enacts her context by interpreting these elements as relevant for her activity. So the context of translation is as important as the human actor in situated approaches, but the context is seen as external to the acting unit itself, the unit that exerts agency. And from an extended perspective, however, the relevant elements of the context are integral parts of the translating unit. Agency is distributed across potentially multiple agents and the material world. So still, even if the approaches seem to disagree when it comes to the analytical unit that carries the agency of an activity, they should not be artificially constructed as a contradiction. There are important commonalities between them. After all, even though individuals take center stage in the person-centered individualized approach, context is still important. Individuals are described in their context and history and not in a vacuum. According to Klaus Kindl, for example, they are subject to contextual and situational constraints. Also, all three approaches reject dehumanized, decontextualized views. The person-oriented individual views argue for a shift from the depersonalized text translation to an individual translator in a socio-historical context. And the extended view argues for a shift from a depersonalized cognitive translation process to a view of actors and activities in a socio-cognitive system. They all strive to study the active role of translators. And they all want to make translators visible, as Kindl writes, appreciating and acknowledging their achievements also shines light on their contribution to the cultural and social spheres of life. So, given these multiple shared motivations, I believe it is possible to find a common path forward for the individualized and the extended orientations in translator studies. All these three approaches to translator studies can be mutually enriching. The person-centered tradition can fruitfully experiment with rethinking the role of the material, social, and historical context of action and be inspired by ideas such as collective agency, socio-cognitive, heterogeneous cognitive systems. And socio-cognitive translation research that relies on extended distributed views of cognition can and should, I think, also take care to ensure that the histories and contexts of the specific persons being studied are also taken into account. So in case-based qualitative studies, data can be elicited together with the participants in their immediate contexts of action, and this methodological approach allows researchers to see the subjects not only as representatives of specific groups like semi-professional translators, project managers, bilinguals, expert translators, but actually trying to also see them as persons with their own histories and own identities. Thank you so much.
Bravo, thank you so much for yet another really mind-stretching and inspiring talk that asks big questions and points to interesting answers about extended translation. We're all dealing in our projects with some form of agency and some form of relationship between the individual and the collective, and it really points to some very inspiring questions that we all need to ask about how we design our research projects. I'm sure there's lots of questions given this new expansive view on agency and collective agency, and in the new domain of translator studies. So I'll open up the floor now for questions. We've got about 15 minutes, so I think we can fit a few questions for discussion in. Philippa.
Hello, first of all, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. I've actually noted down something here, but it may be slightly specific. So if it's better to ask you later when I've got a tutorial with you, that's fine. I was just wondering, in this when you started your discussion about the extended agency, and you were talking about the cognitive artifacts, because in my particular study, I'm doing a textual analysis as part of it, and also paratextual. And I was wondering whether the paratextual aspects here could also be cognitive artifacts, because in this sense, they are comments, peer review, other aspects that involve the thoughts of either the translator and also potentially peer review, other editorial aspects that are going on. It was just a question that came up as I was listening to your talk.
Yes, absolutely. I think what you mentioned, these objects and texts, you could fruitfully understand them as cognitive artifacts when you think that they are kind of epistemic objects. They try to contribute to understanding something, to knowledge, to common knowledge and activities. So yes, absolutely. Of course, we have to. We cannot generalize any scientific or scholarly models so that we suddenly see everything as cognitive artifacts or so. So you have to, I think it makes sense just to look at these definitions and other empirical research that has been carried out and whether it really gives you something new, this perspective. But what you just described rang a bell with me, that reminded me of the idea of epistemic artifacts, and also epistemic actions when you do something in order to change the environment or your position, whatever, and the main goal is to understand something or have knowledge. So that might be something that you actually could use. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, that would definitely make sense because obviously in my case, I'm looking at a journal. So it's the production of knowledge within the field of cardiology,
Yes.
but also the whole of the translation process related to that. So I've noted that down. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Stelios? Stelios, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everyone. Hello. Thank you, Hanna, very much. I follow from Tokyo, a bit far away, but it was a very interesting presentation yesterday and today. I have a series of questions. I'll try to sort of go through them really fast because there are so many colleagues who want me to ask you things. I have a sort of philosophical sort of bewilderment and question with regards to the socio-cognitive approaches. I'm wondering whether since yesterday you spoke about the Anthropocene and how all the more anthropocentric our era becomes, whether now dividing the approaches based on the extensive use of technology isn't it a bit contradictory in a sense? I'm referring also to one of the definitions about agency, willingness, ability, and action, actually, willingness and ability to act and then action. Has a machine, unless we're talking about AI in the future, or not the far away future maybe, but in the future, that's all the, let's say, technological support to translation. Do they offer? Can we talk about agency in those terms, in the terms of those definitions? Another part of thing that crossed my mind: can we enact and apply these methodologies when it comes to historical research in translation, when there was no such a big technological development available? Because I'm dealing also with translation history. And then again, when it comes to the different methodological approaches, which I think roughly from what I understand, it has, on the one extreme, you have the individualized, sort of the focus on the individuals, and gradually you move away from them, including them, but then again going to something bigger. Whether this is not, in any case, somehow, to my eyes, obvious in the sense of epistemology. Can't we go from the particular to the general and vice versa? And yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the many inspiring questions. I will try to give some input, if not maybe answers to all of them. Interesting that you mentioned anthropocentric, because that's maybe a term that I didn't really use, but that's something that one could discuss actually in that context, of course. And I think it's an interesting dilemma, really, because on the one hand, you want to, in the socio-cognitive and extended view, you want to stress that it's not only the brain, it's not only the individual acting, but it's the situation. But on the other hand, also these approaches very much want to humanize cognitive science, want to humanize and kind of individualize in that sense of seeing the human, the specific humans in that specific situation in the center. So I think it's a similar kind of discussion as the post-humanist approaches in translation studies that are not anti-humanist approaches to translation studies, but they want to stress that it is this technological environment is something that so strongly influences the activity that we cannot abstract that or exclude it in our explanations. So yeah, I hope that answers your question to some extent. And also, well, the question of agency is really, for me, it's really agency is something that everybody in all their uses of the term in any publications and presentations need to define what they actually mean with that, because there are so many different views of agency. And I myself use this idea of agency, I allocate agency to this assembly of or assemblage of humans and non-humans, so the interactive unit, but not technology by itself. When you mentioned historical studies, the one thing is, can we actually study historical processes, translation processes from this view, since we can't observe these people anymore? And I think, yes, we can, because as long as we realize what the validity and the status of our data is, that we don't have direct access to these actions, but we only have some traces that you can interpret. And it's always interpretation, even if you observe the situation as such, as it is unfolding. And the other point with historical studies is, you mentioned that there was not this kind of technology. That's true. Of course, we are even more technologically, our translation process are very technology intense. But on the other hand, I think it's important also that these socio-cognitive and extended ideas are not something that are important now since we have technology, but they are just attempts to understand any kind of intelligent activity. So no matter who and when and where, if it's an intelligent agent, even animals, these approaches can be and are used there too, also in robotics, of course, where you try to build interactive units. So it does not have to be a technological environment in order to use these approaches. And as soon and in empirical studies, if you study human-computer interaction, translation as human-computer interaction, it's not automatically from an extended point of view, because then you could use other theoretical backgrounds to study that activity. So you really, I think it's important to use these extended and distributed cognition ideas as theoretical backgrounds that if you use them, you adopt a specific approach, and that gives your data specific status and prefers specific methods and designs. you had a question on epistemology, which I think I already forgot. What was the specific epistemological?
It was the correlation between going from the particular to the general and vice versa.
Yes. Yes, that general development would actually be kind of an inductive approach to a database approach, but I'm not quite sure that it would. Everybody would agree that the individualized translator studies would work on a or from the epistemological point of view, from that perspective, or using only. Maybe that's a parallel that I would need to think about more closely. But it was not an epistemological development in that sense that I proposed.
Okay, thank you very much. Lovely exchange, but in the interest of time and to protect your time for the tutorials which start today, I would propose that you take your questions with you to the tutorials with Professor Risku, if that's okay, unless you really have a burning question that you must ask. All right. So we'll round this session off now. Enjoy the tutorials this afternoon to those of you who have already booked tutorials. And we will see each other tomorrow live for the Q&A with Sara Ramos Pinto tomorrow morning. Thank you, Hanna Risku, for another an enlightening talk. Extended translation will keep us all up into the extended hours of the night and early morning, I hope. And we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you.
See you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.